Hello, I'm Nathaniel, and today I'd like to talk to you about using specific real-world cultures and time periods as a basis for your fantasy world building. There's a lot of things in like the whole writing, world building, story crafting things. There's a lot of things you don't really have to do, and this is one of them. I mean, Tolkien, probably one of the greatest world buildings of it all. You can't exactly sit down and point to a specific culture. He was very Nordic, the northern part of like Scandinavia and England. He was very inspired by that stuff. You can't take a specific culture and say, oh, the Rohirrim are Vikings from AD 800. There's a lot of examples that where people don't do it. Also, Brandon Sanderson doesn't do it. But there are also some reasons why you might want to. Ooh, and you don't exactly have to think about it like you're ripping off a culture and time period. It's more like you're using it as a template. You kind of have a fully fleshed out world, even if you don't base it on like an actual geographic location. You inherit customs, technology level, names. Names is an important thing, especially they're so hard to find. But all of that is cohesive, and you don't have to go looking around for that. I mean, maybe you do. Maybe you want to do something like Brandon Sanderson with his Roshar and have names kind of try to be symmetrical. That's a really cool thing. Maybe you do want to do all that work. But if you don't, you have this nice template that you can go to, and it already has a nice vibe. I was working on, I never got around to writing it, a story that's kind of set in like medieval France, kind of more Dark Ages. Dark Ages is kind of a bad term for the medieval period. Set in like in just a village, and I was trying to find French sounding like French names ish that would be used in the time period and stuff to get a nice cohesive vibe. And the reason why I was looking for this is, and this is the first reason why you would do this, is maybe it's not a big focus on your story. With that story specifically, it was more character based. And it was kind of easier because there'd be less of a steep learning curve, so you could focus specifically on the story you wanted to tell, and then you didn't have to get bogged into telling people about the world. And maybe there are stories that you do want to tell people about the world. It's very cool. The world is almost another character, and that doesn't mean it's like alive. It just means it's very unique and different, and it changes the way the story works. But some stories, it's kind of hard to tell in those. I had another story that I ended up stopping because it had a very interesting world, but I was trying to make a really tight thriller in it. And you really can't do a really tight detective thriller in a fantasy world when you have to front load a ton of information in order for them to figure out the mystery. I mean, that just doesn't work. So I had to put that on the side burner. I'm working on ways to fix that. That was the story I tried to write on a typewriter last year. And I'm making some headway just thinking about it. But you can see how that can be a hindrance, especially when certain kinds of stories. And so that might be why you pull out a template of medieval France or ancient Rome or something. And that gives you some aesthetics, names, everything to play off of. And that doesn't mean they have to be exactly the same. I mean, firstly, you clearly file off the serial numbers and stuff because it's a secondary world, and so it's not France. It's insert name for France Kingdom. And you can make some changes, like maybe you add a fantasy religion, maybe you add a magic system. You're like, this magic system's going to change how they grow crops. This is random. This is not from this stuff. Or maybe they have magical things that turn carts, and so the horses weren't bred as well. And then you can adjust some of the stuff. And so when the reader can notice a couple things that are different, like maybe they don't have horses, maybe they just have magic driving carts. But you're like, this is an interesting fantasy world, but it reminds me a lot about medieval France, the medieval period, or whatever. And so then they kind of don't worry about some other world building stuff, and you just kind of inherit the vibe of the pre-existing time period, and you don't have to do that much work. And because um the reader probably already kind of knows what that time period was like in their head. You don't have to do as much work. You should still do some work, but you don't have to do as much work as laying out the world and the customs and all of that stuff. A second reason why you might want to kind of use a pre-existing location or time period as a template is because you kind of want to play more off their culture and mythology. And this is kind of similar to the first one, except the first one was because you are trying to focus on something else in the world other than the world building, and the second reason is you want to focus on the world building, but you want to focusing on a world building of a specific culture. For example, if you really want to use Greek mythology for your fantasy world and like have cyclops and centaurs and stuff, you probably should base it off Greece culture just to fit with all the aesthetics. You're gonna do that. And maybe it's not Greeks, the islands and nation states of Greek. Maybe you have it kind of different, but it's very similar because that's what you were inspired from. It's not a cop out because the other one's not a cop out. You were inspired by this mythology or time period, and you want to do a story like it because you like the how it feels. And it's not that because you're focusing on other people, you're going to dig deep and go into stuff about it, but you kind of want to do that. This is very interesting because a lot of fantasy, the stock generic fantasy, is medieval Europe overlaid with a lot of fantasy monsters and stuff. And this way you can do something different. You could do Greece, you could do there's a lot of China. Everyone's like you should do more secondary fantasy based off Chinese mythology and ancient China. I've seen a lot of that. That's not my cup of tea and it's not as rare as people think. But that's another example that I've seen a lot of. And so that's a perfectly other reason and it's kind of more obvious. The third one, and this is more for the nitty-gritty world building, is while the other ones is like if you think of it as a template, is keeping the template. The first one is keeping the template because you're not really focusing on the template. You're focusing on other things. The second one is keeping the template because you really like the template. The third reason is just so you have a nice starting out point and kind of like organizing to keep it a little bit simpler. So instead of having to build everything from the ground up, you have a little bit of a skeleton to lay your really good meat of your world building on. The one really good example is Shaddam Brooks, the guy from Shadiversity, his Chronicles of Everfall series. I don't remember that story a lot, so I can't judge. Some people really don't like it, some people love it. But I don't remember it a lot. I'd have to reread it, and I'd want to reread the second edition, which I don't think you can get. But the setting has like floating islands and like really it's like Roshar or other Brandon Sanderson level, like this is not even remotely close to Earth stuff. But he was talking about how the time period was vaguely Renaissance and how he used that to kind of adjust stuff. So like they kind of have the Renaissance level technology on some stuff, except there's magical healing around. So the science of medicine has been developed a way a lot less. And so you can do stuff like that for your world. Maybe you want to do a crazy Wild West, kind of inspired, like you want to kind of be like cowboy time period, but you have a lot of changes. And so you can kind of make the adjustment. So, like, well, we don't have guns, we have magic wands, and they kind of act like guns. But then it kind of develops a lot of things because, like, and so magic's always been there. You didn't have the armor race between weapons and armor before guns came and ruined it, and everyone is literally a glass cannon. But that's different now because they've invested in ways to protect yourself from magic, and because gunpowder really didn't ever become big. If you have magical resistant armor, then you kind of have to go back to hand combat because they didn't develop guns. And that is a very big change. It's not like a slight tweak. And maybe there's no steam trains, or maybe there's no telegraphs, or maybe take your pick. You can start changing things straight from that point, and you can see how even though it's kind of vaguely cowboy because like you kind of go with for the aesthetics, it's very different. You can't just say, okay, this is cowboys, or like a cowboy was teleported there would actually understand what's going on. But it's kind of like you use the template as a checklist of things on whether you want to change it. So, guns. Do I want to change that? Yep, I'm changing it this way. Horses. How am I going to change it? Yes, I'm going to change it this way. Cattle ranges. How am I going to change this? I'm going to make them actually herd magical beasts that make the charges for the ones. Check. And you can go down the list and change a ton of stuff. And it's kind of just to make sure you don't forget anything and kind of get those creative juices flowing, because I made all of that stuff on the spot. There was lots of but it's a good way to kind of think, and it's really fun to do so. It's just fun to make up a world even though you're not going to write anything in it. Finally, and this is a reason that works for all three of the, even if you're not overtly, you can kind of think of what time period in culture it's based off of, even if you don't explicitly pull the stuff, is it's easier to talk to other people about it. I mean, if you have your novel, your fantasy novel in this world, your novel can stand on its own, but you still have to tell people about it. And so if someone's like, hey, what project you're working on? It's like, I'm working on this story. It's really, really cool world. And they're like, world building. And then your other writer friends, oh, it's like, oh, what's the world building? You can't list down and say, like, okay, it's kind of like this. My mind, when I think, how am I going to explain this, tell this to you, my mind automatically goes to, like, oh, it's kind of like Wild West, except this stuff is different. Oh, it's kind of like this. Or it's kind of like ancient Greece, except this. Or it's kind of like ancient Rome, but there's dwarfs. I had to name dwarfs. Dwarfs are awesome. I do think it would be amazing to have a dwarven legion and like have the dwarven empire stretch everywhere. That would be cool. Dwarves could do it if anybody could. Elves couldn't. But it's a good way to pitch. And like maybe when you go eventually sell, I'm not the person to get advice for selling stuff. I've just published one short story and an anthology, and that's it. I have no experience with marketing stuff. But you might be able to find your niche by saying that. So it's like I've seen multiple books that are basically Regency plus fantasy, and maybe even it's a secondary world, but it's Regency plus fantasy, and so that's going to get a lot of the people who like Pride and Prejudice stuff interested, because it's the Regency time period with all of this other stuff, and they really like the vibe, and it's like this plus my other favorite thing, which is magic and fantasy stuff, and oh boy, I can't wait. This is going to be really cool. It's going to be Regency and Dragons, and it's a good way to tell your friends or try to pitch it to editors, publishers, people you want to sell the book at conventions, whatever. It's just a good idea to keep in the back of your mind. World building is in everything. There's plot and character is a big part of fantasy, but you can still hook people just by the world building. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I had a lot of fun making it. And please like and subscribe if you like it. I'm going to do a lot. I do a lot of things about talking about world building and other stuff. I did one a while back on dwarf fortresses, and that one was pretty cool. Maybe I'll have it pop up here. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.